I'm Steve Geiger from Bitmovin. I'm the Director of Solutions for Americas, which means that I interface with our customers and I'm kind of the front line into how our customers implement our products, what sort of questions, issues, and advice they have. The one in the back is my assistant. How many of you guys were in the per title panel that we had yesterday? Show of hands. A couple of you guys. All right, so some of the concepts will come up here again. I mean, a lot of what we do and where we try and focus efforts is to make our encoding and delivery through the player more efficient by using the analytics data that we have available. So we'll walk a little bit through some of the core concepts of what companies are doing today, what to look for and what to understand about playback, about how that impacts your upstream media preparation decisions, what to do with that data, and ultimately how that really helps you and your service. Some of this data will be coming from our 2019 Video Developer Survey. If you're not familiar with it, take a look at it. It has a lot of interesting data on trends from a number of different sources. I'll talk a little bit about that later. The obligatory stuff, Bitmovin, we have 3 core products, player, encoding, and analytics. So if you're interested in those, we have a booth over in the exhibit hall, or you can come talk to me afterwards. I mentioned the Video Developer Survey. A lot of the data that we're covering here either comes from that or comes from sampled analytics data from our customers. The Video Developer Report we conducted had 542 participants across 108 countries and a lot of different roles and responsibilities throughout the organizations that deal with video were respondents into this. So if you take a look at this a little bit afterwards, I know it's small to see, but suffice to say that we had folks from broadcasting, from streaming industry, from advertising, marketing, et cetera, and across the gamut from managerial positions to developers who are writing the lines of code to implement these. All right, so what are the challenges? There are many when we get into video, and these were the Video Developer Report answers. So latency was a really high one. Device fragmentation and playback challenges was another big category. And then a lot of other stuff that we broke down underneath that has to do with media preparation and delivery. And so I'm going to take one of those examples today and talk about how we can use data in order to improve those situations on an individualized basis. Right, so what are people using today in order to collect their data and to act upon it? This was kind of surprising to me, but you know, a large number of the respondents, 23%, don't use a video analytics tool at all. So I'm not sure how they're looking at their performance and looking to improve it. But then also, if you look on the top line there, 35% use Google Analytics as a tool, which isn't a specifically video-based tool. And so you can feed it a lot of good data, but maybe you're not getting the most specific data to help your video use cases. In the pie chart here, you can also see that a lot of people were looking at pretty core video metrics, video buffering rate, video startup time, video errors, all really important ones. But not necessarily the ones that'll help you upstream in your content preparation either. And this kind of sets up the use case that we'll talk about. The respondents from the video survey told us, you know, which codecs they're using today and what they plan to use in the future. Unsurprisingly, you know, almost everyone using AVC because that's the most pervasive codec that's out there. But a relatively low amount, 11% using today and 12% planning to use VP9. And you know, maybe a higher percentage here of 43% using HEVC and 32% looking to use it in the future. So taking a break from that, we'll look at some of the analytics data that might be key points to track in making your decisions about video preparation. So screen resolutions and those being presented based on the playback experiences are a core piece of this. And as I talk about this, the thing that I will really want everyone to focus on is that it's best to look at your data. Industry benchmarks will give you a good idea of directionally where to go, but when you collect that via your own analytics tooling, when you pull in your own data, you'll start to see the deviations that you have from those industry standards, and that can mean a big difference in your performance and your savings, ultimately, when you start to make decisions based off of that. So the core thing here is don't encode resolutions that your users can't benefit from. So here we don't see really any 4K utilization, so let's not produce any 4K renditions or serve those up to these customers. Scale factor is another thing that a lot of people don't consider, but is a relatively important one. Really what we're looking at here is what resolution was delivered versus the detected resolution of the playback. And again, you're optimally going to match this and have no scale factor. If you're scaling video down, that means that you're potentially wasting bits. You have a higher resolution than you needed to deliver. Scaling video up means that your users aren't getting the ideal experience. Now, there are caveats to that. And sometimes you do want to be in a situation where you're scaling down video. But this is a general rule, and you want to really try and aim for this whenever it is possible. Right, and then lastly, we're going to take a look at bitrate, and we're going to take a look at that in two different ways. So one is don't generate bit rates that your users can't watch, right? You obviously have a pretty even trend here around that 900 kilobit mark here. So producing a 3 or 4 megabit rendition isn't going to do your users very much good. They'll never adapt up to it. But then also looking at what we call a heat map or a density graph of what people are watching over time, and looking at the distribution of your users across those renditions. So here in a different situation, we have about a quarter of people hitting the highest rendition of 4.8 megabits. We have folks that are going to be down into the 800 to 400 kilobits, but there's this kind of odd stripe in the middle that in this case, we kind of track back down to zero rated or capped data plans. So there was kind of a gap there in which we weren't going to have any viewership of that 1.21 megabit. So maybe that's not something that you needed to produce. So ultimately, we want to come back to one of the things that I mentioned earlier, which is video codec support, another thing that you can get from your analytics. And here, again, the pervasiveness of AVC, so great, everybody can receive that. We have 19% at HEVC and 74% at VP9, as well as a 55% for AV1. So the interesting fact here is if you remember what the plans were and what people were implementing, again, in kind of a general role, is that they were doing way more HEVC than they were VP9. But when you start to peel back the data and look into it, the actual kind of addressable market for those codecs might be a little different. And here's just a reminder of that. So we'll come back specifically to the video codec support aspect of that and show how specialized or individualized data for your service and your users might be the most useful way to go. But just to kind of talk about how this all works. This is kind of how we see the landscape and where our products plug in, but I think it's a useful visual for anyone. When you're implementing, you prepare the content through the encoder, you're going to distribute that through a CDN, you get your playback, and then you have an analytics tool. In this case, ours is listening to player events and providing that data back through into a dashboard that can ultimately start to inform decisions back into your pipeline, whether that's into your encoding, as I'm talking about today and giving an example of, or feeding back into your player and helping you make decisions about how you tune or configure your player. So here we're talking about generating an initial encoding profile, collecting that data, updating those profiles based on the usage data, and using some of those analytics, the consumption statistics, the user device data, and what people are able to play back in order to drive better decision making and to measure continuously and improve that kind of virtuous cycle. So how does this ultimately help you? As we looked at the different video codecs that you're able to generate and what people were planning on doing, this just gives you an idea of the landscape of coverage from a device support standpoint. So, looks pretty good. We have full coverage for AVC. We've got a decent amount of coverage from a device standpoint for HEVC, really focused on Safari and iOS mainly. VP9 adds in Chrome and Firefox and gets Android, but doesn't necessarily cover iOS. So from a distribution and device standpoint, this seems like they might be on a pretty even and level playing field. But really when you start digging into the data, and this is, again, anonymized data from a set of our customers in different locales, you start to see that this is quite different and has a major impact when you look at it from a regional perspective. This isn't even from a customer base, but a regional perspective. And all of a sudden your HEVC support that makes a decent amount of sense in the US with almost 40% starts to make less and less sense if you're going to go and try to produce that and roll it out in Brazil or India where you're at 5 or 2%. So ultimately what that accounts to is if you look at that data and you lay that over with the bandwidth reduction savings that is estimated for those codecs in general, while you might get a relatively even savings in US for VP8, VP9, or H.265 or HEVC implementation, when you go into other markets, you're talking about a 20 to 21% difference there. So ultimately, look at that real data, look at really what's coming back from your users, and feed that back into your decision making when you're generating your content. And this can be used not only from a codec perspective, but as we talked about yesterday, in a per title perspective. So using that data, what your available bandwidth is, what your available screen sizes are, and tailoring even that per title algorithm that we might use to optimize encodes on an individual title basis with this data to have those profiles constrained to match your audience. All right. Quick run through of all of that to give you guys the background and the information, but mainly wanted to open this up for Q&A and other scenarios that you guys would like to hear about.
All right, so we've got a few minutes for question and answers. Who's got a question for Bitmovin? All right, right away. Here you go.
So the virtual cycle that you're talking about, if you're doing live streaming, is that real time, or is this something you do a live stream at an event, you learn, and then the next time you do it differently if that's what the data says?
I mean, it depends on the technology that you're using, right? If you're using some just-in-time technologies to produce your live streams, then yeah, maybe you could, make some influence on your decisions while you're presenting your live streams to users. But, really, I think not a lot of us want to take that risk and, start throwing monkey wrenches into your live streams as they're going on, because if it truly is a live event or something like that, it's only happening once, right? You can make an optimization that then impacts the stability of your stream, and now you've done something that aimed to optimize it but ultimately ended up not being able to deliver that to a handful of users even. So, my recommendation when dealing with especially live events is to go in, take that sampling, learn from that, try to replicate that again in your next stream. We recently did a large-scale live event for a customer, and we looked at their data over time as they did other live events and just their general streaming on their website. We blended all that data together and started to see that their metrics were skewed, and this is a US customer, but their metrics were highly skewed in terms of codec support, and they had over 75% VP9 support across their user base. So that was a no-brainer for them when looking at it to say, all right, well, it's worth spinning up a couple of renditions of VP9 for those users. They all had really high bandwidth. They all had VP9 support, and that cut 30% off of what they were delivering versus AVC.
Okay, do we have another? Going once, going twice? Anybody? Okay, well, thank you so much. Bitmovin, do you have anything else you want to say?
No, I think if you have any other questions, come find me. I'll be at the booth for the rest of the day, or just come up here if you want to grab your notebook and have any other questions that you want to ask. I'm here and available.
All right, round of applause, everybody.
Thank you.